She fined a single father and his daughter for fishing, but she didn't know that everything was about to change. He bought the lake and set his own rules. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun had barely lifted over the rooftops of Lakeview Park when Michael Carter stepped onto the back porch of his new home. The air still carried a faint coolness, a lingering trace of dawn, though he knew it wouldn't last. By mid-morning, the Florida heat would settle in like an unwelcome guest. He stood there for a moment, coffee in hand, looking out across the neat line of houses and manicured lawns. It had been 6 months since he and his 8-year-old daughter Lily had moved here, leaving behind the cramped townhouse in the city where noise and sirens were part of the daily soundtrack. The move had drained much of his savings, but the promise of a quieter, safer life for Lily had been worth every cent. Since his wife's death 3 years ago, Michael had taken on both roles, mother and father, comforter and provider. It was not an easy road, but it had made the bond with his daughter unshakable. Lakeview Park, with its guarded gates and winding streets lined with oak trees, seemed the perfect place for her to grow up without the constant worry that had followed them in the city. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was part of the package. He'd read their rules carefully before buying the house, finding them strict but manageable. Lawn height limits, approved paint colors, regulations about garbage bins and exterior lighting. He'd followed them all to the letter. It was in his nature to keep things in order. That morning, as the first real rays of sunlight began to warm the wooden boards beneath his feet, he heard Lily's small footsteps on the porch. She wore her rain boots and a faded blue jacket, her fishing pole in hand, the one they had picked out together after the move. Fishing had been his father's tradition with him, and now it was his turn to pass it down. He smiled as she joined him, her hair still messy from sleep, but her eyes bright with excitement. Today would be their first fishing trip at the community lake. By the time they reached the water, the neighborhood was only just beginning to stir. The lake lay smooth and still, its surface touched by the orange glow of the rising sun. Ducks floated lazily near the reeds, and the wooden pier, weathered but sturdy, stretched a few yards into the water. Michael set down their tackle box and bait while Lily sat cross-legged on the edge of the pier, peering into the water as if she might spot the fish before she cast her line. He felt an ease in his chest, a slowing of the constant hum of responsibility. This was what he had wanted, moments like these, where the world was simple and they could just be father and daughter. The first line went in with a soft plunk, sending ripples outward. They spoke little, content in the quiet, the gentle lapping of water against the posts beneath them. The scent of the lake brought back flashes of his childhood, his father's deep laugh when he lost a fish, the thermos of coffee they always carried, the cool mornings that seemed endless. Now it was Lily beside him, and the thought filled him with quiet pride. It was the sound of footsteps on the gravel path behind them that drew his attention away from the bobbing line. Slow, deliberate steps, followed by the click of something plastic against a clipboard. He turned to see a woman approaching, tall, with short steel-gray hair and sunglasses perched high on her nose despite the early hour. She wore a pressed blouse and khaki slacks, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was used to being listened to. Michael had seen her before from a distance. That was Karen Miller, president of the HOA, known by reputation for her unyielding enforcement of the rules. She didn't greet them. Instead, she stopped a few feet from the pier and looked at him as if she had caught a trespasser. "This is not an approved recreational activity," she said, her voice cutting through the morning stillness. The words landed oddly in his ears, their formality clashing with the serenity of the lake. Michael blinked, then pointed toward the state-issued fishing permit tucked into his tackle box. He had paid for it just last month, as required. "State permits aren't the issue," she replied with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is HOA property. You need authorization from the board before fishing here." For a moment, he thought he had misheard. "So, even though I'm a resident, up to date on my dues, and have a legal permit, I still have to ask permission?" Her expression didn't change. "Exactly." She made a note on her clipboard, and then, without hesitation, produced a pre-printed violation notice. "You'll be receiving a fine for unauthorized use of community property. $500, payable within 30 days. She handed him the slip, the paper stiff and impersonal, his name already neatly typed at the top. He stared at it, unable to disguise his disbelief. 500 for fishing? The answer came swiftly. You broke HOA rules, and rules are what keep this community desirable. There was no point in arguing, not with the way she stood there, the weight of her authority behind her words. She turned without another glance and walked back toward a small golf cart parked near the path, her clipboard tucked under her arm. The peaceful morning was gone. Michael reeled in the line, his movements stiff, and began packing their things. Lily watched him with a puzzled frown, sensing the change even if she didn't understand it. They walked back home in silence, the bright promise of the day replaced by a simmering irritation that clung to him like the humidity in the air. That afternoon, while checking the mailbox, he spoke with his neighbor, Tom Jensen, who lived 2 doors down. Tom shook his head when Michael mentioned the fine. You're not the first. Last summer, my sister tried to have a picnic here. Just sandwiches, nothing fancy. And Karen fined me $200 for unauthorized use of common space. The words tightened something in Michael's chest. Wasn't that what these areas were for? For residents to enjoy? Tom shrugged. You'd think so, but around here, Karen's word is law. Most people just pay to avoid the headache. That evening over dinner, he told Lily they would go fishing somewhere else next time. She nodded without complaint, but he could see her disappointment. As she cleared her plate, he sat there turning the fine over in his hands, the bold words "violation notice" glaring up at him. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was the principle, the idea that one person could impose her will without listening, without reason. 2 days later, the official letter arrived in the mail, the same form Karen had handed him, now on HOA letterhead with payment instructions printed in bold. The only way to appeal was to attend the next board meeting, chaired by Karen herself. He set the letter on his desk beside his fishing permit, the contradiction between the two gnawing at him. In the days that followed, he found himself replaying the scene in his head, her voice carrying across the pier, the smug precision with which she filled out the form, the lack of interest in anything he had to say. It wasn't just a fine, it was the dismissal of his right to be there, to share a quiet morning with his daughter without interference. He began to notice small things. The way neighbors lowered their voices when talking about the HOA, the wary looks when her name came up, the stories people told, warnings over mailbox paint colors, citations for leaving trash bins out too long, fines for planting flowers not on the approved list. By the end of the week, Michael realized he was no longer just irritated. He was unsettled. The lake was more than a pretty view. It was a piece of their community life. And if Karen could take that away on a whim, what else could she control? When the next weekend came, he didn't go fishing. Instead, he stood on his porch early Saturday morning, coffee in hand, staring toward the trees that hid the water from view. He felt the fine in his pocket, not as paper, but as weight and unspoken reminder that in Lakeview Park, freedom came with conditions. And sometimes those conditions were written by people who had no interest in fairness. It was in that quiet moment, with the sun just cresting the rooftops, that a thought settled in his mind. This wasn't over. Not yet. And if there was one thing he had learned in the past 3 years, it was that when something threatened the life he was building for Lily, he would find a way to fight back. The fine notice remained on Michael's desk for several days, lying beside the neat green card of his state fishing permit, each a silent witness to the contradiction he could not let go of. In the mornings, as he sipped his coffee before waking Lily for school, his eyes would drift to that corner of the desk. He had always been a man who followed rules, believing that structure was a kind of safety, but now the paper seemed to mock him, reminding him that the rules here could be bent, reinterpreted, and wielded like a weapon in the hands of someone determined to control. By the following week, he knew that ignoring it would not make it easier. He could have paid the $500 and moved on, as most people apparently did. But each time the thought crossed his mind, something in him hardened. It was not about the money. It was about the idea that a quiet morning spent fishing with his daughter could be transformed into an offense punishable by a fine. That the place he now called home was policed not for safety or community well-being, but for obedience to a single will. He started in the most obvious place, the HOA's own bylaws. One evening after Lily was asleep, he logged into the association's online portal and opened the thick PDF labeled Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. The document was long and dry, pages of clauses that seemed designed to wear a reader down. But Michael had spent enough years in business to know how to scan for the important parts. He searched for every mention of the lake, reading each section slowly. There it was. Use of common areas may be regulated by the board to ensure safety, preserve property values, and promote harmonious enjoyment by all residents. The language was vague, almost deliberately so. Nowhere did it say that fishing required individual approval from the board. There was a section about water safety and another about maintaining cleanliness, but nothing that matched what Karen had claimed. He sat back in his chair, frowning. If the rules were written like this, it meant they could be interpreted however the board wished. The next day, he began to ask questions in a careful, roundabout way. He started with his neighbor Tom, then with Mrs. Henderson across the street, a soft-spoken widow who had lived in Lakeview Park for 15 years. Each conversation brought another story. Tom's sister's picnic fine was just the beginning. Mrs. Henderson told him about the time she had been threatened with a citation for a non-conforming bird feeder, even though it had been there for years without complaint. A retired couple down the block had been warned about their grandson's car being parked in their driveway because it clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. It was during one of these casual talks on a warm Thursday afternoon that he met Harold Simmons, an elderly man who had been one of the first homeowners in Lakeview Park. Harold was sitting on his porch nursing a glass of iced tea, and he invited Michael to sit for a minute out of the sun. The conversation turned to the lake without prompting. "You know," Harold said, lowering his voice as if the water itself might be listening, "that lake's been more trouble than it's worth for years. People think the HOA owns it, but that's never been true. It used to belong to some fellow lived up north somewhere. When he stopped paying his taxes, the county took it. Far as I know, it's been sitting in their books ever since." Michael felt a slow, deliberate spark in his mind. If the HOA didn't own the lake, how could they fine him for using it? He pressed Harold for details, but the older man just shrugged. "That's just what I've heard. Karen doesn't like people knowing it. Makes her job harder, I guess." That night, as Lily worked on her homework at the kitchen table, he sat across from her, his thoughts miles away. If Harold was right, then everything Karen had said at the lake was built on an illusion. He needed to know for sure. It would not be enough to take someone's word for it. He wanted proof, something in writing, something undeniable. The next morning, he drove to the Marion County Clerk's office in Ocala. The building was quiet, the air conditioning a welcome relief from the thick summer heat outside. At the records desk, a clerk named Bill, a friendly man in his 50s with a tie that had seen better days, tapped at his keyboard while Michael gave him the location. "Lake off Willowbrook Drive?" Bill asked, glancing at the screen. "Let's see. Yep, here it is. Owner listed as Marion County, tax claim, no private owner at the moment." Michael leaned forward, his voice careful. "So it's county-owned?" Bill nodded. "That's right. Been in forfeiture for a while. If someone pays the back taxes and fees, they can take ownership. Not cheap, but not outrageous either. You thinking about it?" On the drive home, Michael's mind wouldn't settle. He had come looking for confirmation and found it. The HOA had no legal claim to the lake. The power Karen wielded over it was nothing more than the power of perception, the assumption that she had authority because no one had challenged her. If he bought it, the dynamic would change entirely. He could decide who used the lake. He could strip the HOA of its favorite tool for asserting control. That evening after dinner, he brought it up with Lily in the simplest way he could. "What if the lake belonged to us?" She looked at him with wide eyes, not fully understanding, but her smile told him all he needed to know. He didn't tell her about the costs or the risks, or the fact that buying it would almost certainly put him in Karen's crosshairs. Over the next week, he studied his finances. Years of running his own contracting business had left him in a better position than most, though the purchase would still be significant. He met with his accountant, who confirmed that it was doable. He spoke to a lawyer to understand the responsibilities that would come with ownership liability insurance, maintenance, environmental regulations. There were no major obstacles. In the evenings, he continued to gather stories from neighbors. He wasn't just building a case in his mind, he was taking the measure of the community, seeing who might support him and who might not. Some people like Tom seemed quietly thrilled at the idea of someone pushing back against Karen. Others were more cautious, warning him that taking her on would lead to a flood of petty violations, legal threats, and whispered campaigns against him. Late one night, he sat at his dining table with a legal pad in front of him. He wrote down every reason to walk away: the cost, the inevitable conflict, the possibility that owning the lake might make him a target. Then he wrote down every reason to move forward: ending the arbitrary fines, protecting a space for his daughter and the neighbors who had endured years of overreach. The satisfaction of knowing that Karen's authority had limits. The second list was longer. By the time the paper was filled, his decision was made. He would do it. Not to be a hero, not even out of revenge, though he would be lying if he said the thought of Karen's face when she realized the lake was no longer hers to control didn't give him a certain grim pleasure, but because it was the only way to change the game entirely. As he turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs to check on Lily, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The fine on his desk was still there, but soon it would mean nothing. Soon the lake would belong to him, and the rules would no longer be written solely by someone who believed herself untouchable. The morning he drove back to the Marion County Clerk's office to finalize the purchase, Michael felt a taut, electric anticipation running through him, as if every movement pulling on his shirt, locking the door behind him, turning the key in the ignition, was part of a slow countdown. For a week he had been living in a kind of quiet preparation, the decision sitting in his mind like a heavy stone, yet carrying with it a strange buoyancy. He had thought about it from every angle, tested the idea for weakness, and found that even the risks seemed preferable to the slow, corrosive effect of doing nothing. Owning the lake was no longer a hypothetical, it was the next necessary step. The roads into Ocala were nearly empty that early, the rising sun low in the sky, throwing long bands of light across the hood of his truck. When he arrived, the building was the same as before. Modest, functional, smelling faintly of old paper and industrial-strength cleaner. Bill the clerk was at his desk again, the knot of his tie sitting slightly askew. When Michael slid the cashier's check across the counter, there was no ceremony, no fanfare, just a series of signatures, initials, page stamps, and the quiet shuffle of papers being placed into a thin manila folder. "That's it," Bill said finally, handing him the deed. His own name was printed there in clean black ink. Owner, Michael Carter. He stared at it for a moment, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement of the change it represented. The lake that had been a backdrop to warnings, fines, and arbitrary rules was now his. And with that came the certainty that nothing in Lakeview Park would remain quite the same. On the drive home, he imagined Karen's reaction. He could see her arched brows, the tight, measured smile that would mask her anger, the flicker in her eyes when she realized her control had evaporated overnight. He didn't plan to flaunt it, at least not in any way that would make him seem petty, but he also wasn't going to pretend this wasn't a reversal she would feel acutely. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Lily was at the window, her face pressed against the glass, waiting for him. He showed her the folder, and though she didn't fully understand the paperwork, the way his voice lifted when he said, "It's ours," was enough to make her beam. That evening, after she was in bed, he drafted a letter. It was short to the point, printed on plain white paper. To all residents of Lakeview Park, effective immediately, the lake property is privately owned and no longer under the authority of the HOA. Access will be granted by invitation only. Please direct any request to the owner, Michael Carter. He slid the copies into envelopes and dropped them into mailboxes the next morning, the dew still clinging to the grass as he walked from house to house. It was an act both simple and monumental, words on paper that would shift the center of power in their small, tightly wound community. The reactions began almost at once. That afternoon, Tom found him in the driveway, his grin wide. "You actually did it," he said. And though he didn't need to explain what it was, His tone carried something close to admiration. Others were more cautious, offering polite but non-committal responses, as though weighing the consequences before deciding which side to stand on. By evening, the neighborhood's private Facebook group had lit up with posts, some congratulatory, others accusatory. Supporters praised the move as overdue, a stand against arbitrary enforcement. One woman wrote that she'd stopped using the lake years ago because she was tired of being watched like a criminal while sitting by the water. Others were less charitable. So now one man controls what used to belong to everyone? One post read, drawing dozens of comments in quick succession. Selfish, another declared. Power grab. It wasn't long before Karen made her own move. That same evening, an email from the HOA board landed in residents' inboxes. Its subject line stark. Important notice regarding lake access. In it, Karen described the purchase as a disruption to the harmony and shared resources of our community, implying that the decision would negatively impact property values and neighborly goodwill. She ended the message with a promise. The board is exploring all avenues to restore the lake to the community. Michael read it twice, recognizing the careful phrasing. There was no outright falsehood, but the omissions were just as powerful. Nowhere did she mention that the HOA had never legally owned the lake. Nowhere did she acknowledge that her own fines and restrictions had been the catalyst for this shift. It was pure framing, a bid to keep the narrative in her hands. Over the next days, the divide deepened. Passing conversations by the mailboxes or on the walking paths around the neighborhood became more pointed, sometimes hushed, sometimes sharp. An older couple he barely knew stopped him to thank him for finally doing something about her. 2 houses down, a man in a pressed polo shirt approached to tell him that his kids had fished in that lake every summer and now couldn't. "You're punishing people who had nothing to do with this?" the man said, his voice clipped. Michael answered evenly that the lake had never belonged to the HOA and that he intended to allow fair access, just not under her authority. The man shook his head and walked away without another word. The more Michael moved through the neighborhood, the more he could feel the currents swirling beneath the surface. Karen had allies, people who valued the strict rules because they believed it preserved the character of the place, or because they had never been on the wrong side of her enforcement. They repeated her talking points in casual conversation, turning his decision into a test of loyalty. At the same time, there were those who had lived under the weight of her watchfulness for too long and saw in Michael's actions a kind of liberation. Karen, for her part, became more visible than usual. He saw her inspecting properties from her golf cart, pausing to jot notes on her clipboard, her gaze sweeping over yards and driveways with deliberate precision. On the community bulletin board, she posted a reminder about proper conduct when using shared spaces, complete with a photograph of the lake, an image now as symbolic as it was literal. The implication was clear. This was the community's space, and she intended to fight to make it so again. By midweek, Michael began hearing from people outside Lakeview Park. A friend from town called to say the story had made its way into a local blog that covered neighborhood politics and disputes. The headline was direct: "Resident buys HOA's lake and bans HOA from it." The comments beneath the article mirrored what he was seeing at home, half in support, half in outrage. For all the noise, the mechanics of ownership were quiet, almost mundane. He met with his lawyer again to discuss insurance coverage and maintenance plans. The lake was small enough to manage without excessive expense, but he would need to hire someone to handle occasional upkeep and inspections. It was his responsibility now, and he intended to meet it fully. One evening, as the sun slipped low and the lake turned to a sheet of burnished gold, he stood at the water's edge, the deed tucked safely at home. It was the same place where Karen had handed him that fine weeks ago, the same boards underfoot, the same gentle lap of water against the pier. But it felt different now, not just because it was his, but because he had acted when it would have been easier to yield. He thought of Lily's small hands gripping her fishing pole, her eagerness that morning, and knew he had done the right thing, even if half the neighborhood thought otherwise. What he didn't know, couldn't yet see, was how much deeper the conflict would run, how the purchase would become not just a question of property, but of identity for the community. For Karen, it was more than a loss of control. It was a challenge to the structure she had built over years, a structure in which her authority was unquestioned. And for those watching from the sidelines, it was a test. Accept the shift or resist it. Michael left the lake that evening, aware of the eyes on him from the houses nearby. Some of those eyes followed him with quiet approval. Others, he suspected, carried the glint of challenge. Either way, the next move was his, and the next chapter in the fight for the lake and for the balance of power in Lakeview Park was already beginning to write itself. The week after Michael's letter announcing the new rules had gone out was unlike anything he had experienced in Lakeview Park. It was as if the neighborhood had shed its veneer of manicured calm and polite greetings to reveal a restless, divided heart. The tension was there in the clipped smiles exchanged on the walking paths, in the conversations that stopped abruptly when he passed, in the overbright politeness from those who didn't quite know where they stood. He could feel the air between houses brimming with speculation, every porch light and curtain concealing opinions that were being whispered over dinner tables and tapped out into private message threads. It was almost inevitable that Karen would call a meeting. The notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board and in every mailbox one humid Tuesday afternoon. Special board session, community harmony and shared resources. The wording was her signature style, bland on the surface, but with an undercurrent sharp enough to cut. The date was set for Thursday evening in the community hall. He knew before he finished reading that the lake would dominate the agenda and that she would be framing the conversation in her own terms. On the night of the meeting, the hall was already buzzing when Michael arrived. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, some leaning against the back wall. A low hum of voices filled the space, the kind of restless energy that could tip into open confrontation if given the right push. At the front, the long table where the HOA board sat was neatly arranged with nameplates and stacks of paper. Karen was in her seat at the center, posture impeccable, a faint smile that looked more like a practiced mask than a sign of welcome. When the meeting came to order, she didn't waste time. She began with a preamble about the values of the community, the importance of shared resources, the lake as a cornerstone of their lifestyle. Then came the pivot. She described the change in ownership as a disruption, a unilateral action that had deprived residents of something they had long enjoyed. She spoke of property values, of the risk of division, of the need to restore harmony. Her voice carried with ease, practiced and confident. And as she spoke, heads in the crowd nodded in agreement. When she finished, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if he would respond. Michael stood slowly, letting the silence draw just long enough to make the shift in attention complete. He spoke evenly, without raising his voice, explaining what the county records had shown, that the lake had never been HOA property, that its use had been controlled by implication and assumption rather than law. He described the fine for fishing, the stories he'd heard from neighbors about arbitrary citations, the way those rules had been used to intimidate rather than protect. He didn't dwell on her name, but it hung in the space between his sentences like an unspoken subject everyone understood. Some faces in the crowd turned toward him with a kind of dawning recognition, others with open skepticism. A man in the back called out, asking who would be allowed to use the lake now. Michael told them plainly that access would be granted to those who respected fair use, and that it would not be mediated by the HOA. That answer brought a ripple through the room, approval from some, muttered disapproval from others. A woman near the front accused him of using the situation as payback. He told her it was about protecting rights, not revenge, about ensuring that the community couldn't be ruled by one person's unchecked authority. Karen responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said that property ownership came with responsibilities, with liabilities, with costs he might not have considered. She spoke as though she were offering him an education in realities he hadn't anticipated, but he had anticipated them. He said as much, and that he was prepared to meet those responsibilities without ceding control back to a board that had abused it. The back and forth continued for a few minutes more, but it was clear the room was split. Some clapped quietly when he spoke, others when she did. When the meeting finally adjourned, the hallway outside became a hive of murmurs and side conversations. People lingered in clusters, voices low but intense. He walked out into the thick evening air, with the sense that nothing had been resolved, only pushed further into the open. In the days that followed, the division didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. On his walks with Lily, he noticed which neighbors waved and which turned away. A few stopped him to ask about membership, to tell him they supported what he'd done. Others avoided his eyes or made a point of crossing the street before they reached him. Karen kept up her presence, driving her golf cart past his house more than once a day, always with her clipboard in hand. Then one morning, a thick envelope appeared in his mailbox. It bore the letterhead of a law firm in Orlando. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA's attorney, claiming that his restrictions on lake access violated the spirit of the community's covenants and that the board was prepared to pursue legal action to restore those rights. It was written in the kind of careful, combative language designed to intimidate, to make the recipient imagine courtrooms and costs and months of drawn-out conflict. He read it twice before placing it on the kitchen table. Monica, his sister, who had stopped by that morning, looked at it with a raised eyebrow. "They're trying to scare you," she said. "It's a bluff." He nodded, but he knew that even a bluff could be expensive to answer. That afternoon, the local news station ran a segment on the dispute, complete with interviews from both sides. Tom spoke in his favor, describing the purchase as a stand against overreach. Another neighbor, Denise, said he was holding the community hostage. Karen's interview was measured, almost gentle, as she spoke of fairness, unity, and restoring what had been lost. Watching it, he realized she was playing a longer game, shaping the perception of those who weren't in the room for the messy, complicated parts. The attention spilled over into the broader public. A state newspaper ran a feature on HOA disputes, using Lakeview Park as a case study. Property rights forums online debated whether he was a defender of freedom or an egotist who had found a loophole to seize power. Even strangers reached out, some to offer support, others to tell him what they thought of his decision in blunt, unfiltered terms. Through it all, he stayed focused on the core reason for what he had done. He kept working with his lawyer to formalize the rules for the lake, to make sure they were clear and enforceable, to prevent any backdoor claims from the HOA. He knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, that she might try other Angles County codes, environmental reviews, anything that might chip away at his position. But he also knew he couldn't control her every move. What he could control was how he stood his ground. One evening, as the air cooled and the cicadas started their low chorus, he took Lily down to the pier. They sat with their lines in the water, the lake calm under the last light of day. He watched her focus on the bobber, her small hands steady on the rod, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Around them, the debates, the meetings, the letters, the headlines, they were still there, still unresolved. But here, in this moment, he had reclaimed what mattered, the right to be here with his daughter, without fear of a clipboard-wielding figure coming to declare it forbidden. For the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. He knew the conflict would flare again, that Karen would find new ways to press her case, but he had drawn his line and stood by it. The lake lay before them, silvered by the setting sun, a mirror for the simple truth he had come to understand. In a place where authority could be twisted to suit one person's will, sometimes the only way to keep what was yours was to own it outright, no matter the storm that followed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another unforgettable journey and explore our other videos for more powerful stories. And please, share this one with someone who needs to hear it.